I think it's worth us, in the context of us looking at the effect of Chinese investment in Africa and the growing investment from other BRIC countries and other emerging markets and inward investment within Africa, it's worth us taking a step back and looking at the West's engagement in Africa, because Western interest is still overwhelmingly dominant in Africa. And it's a pleasure to see the people here today and the degree to which that reflects how central and important Africa is becoming to the world as a whole. But the people here who are all engaged in Africa in one way and another are either African or they're representing Western interests. I mean, I don't see any Chinese here or Brazilians here or Indians here. And I think that is indicative of the fact that Western interests are still dominant in Africa, and the importance of Western interests, commercially, politically, diplomatically, culturally, are still central to the success or failure of the next phase of Africa's development. I think we should look at what the West still has to offer Africa and what's good and bad about Western engagement in the new Africa as it develops. And there's no doubt that, historical baggage aside, Western political and commercial culture has a very important ongoing role to play in Africa. The tradition of good governance and accountability and transparency are more prevalent in Western engagement than there are in the engagements from non-Western, i.e. European and American countries. And this comes hand in hand with a degree of perceived moral responsibility, which is likewise more prevalent and important in Western engagement than in engagement from other sources and other parts of the world. I've just returned from Rwanda, where we own and operate the biggest of the country's tin and tungsten mines. And I think that Rwanda and the Great Lakes region as a whole provides some very good examples of both the good side and the bad side of Western engagement in Africa. In Rwanda, in the 19 years since the genocide, the government of President Paul Kagame has very successfully exploited and leveraged the guilt and sympathy of the West into multilateral and bilateral aid and assistance that have allowed a remarkable infrastructural and economic redevelopment and a return to social cohesion and stability. But the ongoing momentum of Kagame's program is now being prejudiced by the withdrawal of some of this assistance as a result of the perceived support by the Rwandan military of the M23 rebels in the Congo next door in the eastern Congo. I don't have any particular insight into the facts of Rwandan assistance and engagement in the Kivus, but it does seem that the Western action in this regard is based on inadequate intelligence and a naive lack of understanding of the complex history of the region and the extreme importance of what is happening next door in the DRC to the ongoing security and internal stability of Rwanda. Western actions of this type are also often led by domestic political, populist, and media considerations rather than by a sober consideration of what is in the best interests of either Western interests or of the interests of the region. In fact, it could be argued in this case that the conflict or heightened level of conflict in the eastern DRC that Rwanda is accused of being complicit in is in part a direct result of another Western engagement, this being the conflict minerals bill that was tacked onto the Dodd-Frank Act, which was passed by the American legislature in July 2010. And this legislation again arose, in my view, out of naive populist and media considerations. And while the goals of limiting funding opportunities to rebel armies perpetrating terrible acts against civilians in the Congo are clearly laudable goals, the blunt tools that are being employed have put hundreds of thousands of artisanal miners out of work and without any doubt in my mind resulted in considerably increased deprivation and hence conflict. So unless the West look very carefully at the effects of this type of engagement with real facts rather than with a purely populist media and NGO type perspective, the West will radically undermine the effectiveness of Western engagement in Africa with very negative consequences, both for Western strategic interests and for the interests of Africa, which is still not dependent, but can still benefit very considerably by responsible, pragmatic, educated Western engagement in Africa's development, an engagement that is not coming out of a kind of colonial mindset of guilt or moral responsibility, but an engagement coming out of mutual respect and mutual interest. Thank you.